topic, and it's not just an important topic for those of us with children. This impacts our communities, it impacts all of us. So I'm going to leave it with our New York State Coordinator, Diane Durdaller. I always screw it up. And let her get this panel started. And as I mentioned before the break, we'll go right into Dan Bongino afterwards.
Oh, that's so cute.
Thank you, Stacy. As Stacy mentioned, I am from New York. I've been the New York State Coordinator for the last 5 years. In addition to that, I am starting my 22nd year in the education field in September. And for the last 7 years, I've worked at John W. Dodd Middle School in Freeport, New York, which is on Long Island. And believe it or not, there are more conservative teachers in New York than you think. And once they find one person's loud, that wouldn't be me, of course, they kind of glom on, and we're getting them bit by bit. So this past Wednesday, New York State Department of Education released our results for our English and math state tests that our students took back in September. And when these tests were, before they were even given, we were told that our scores were going to go down significantly. And they were correct. As a state, 31% of our students were considered proficient in math, statewide. 31% of our students were considered proficient in English. And that's a drop of almost 25% of where we were last year. So why did our scores go down so horribly in 1 year? It's not because of what was taught in the classroom. It's because we aligned our state tests with the Common Core standards. And to discuss what Common Core is, how it affects our children in the classroom, and how to fight back, we have on the panel today Joy Pullman from the Heartland Institute, Rosa Leonetti, New Jersey SGPA State Coordinator and Educator, and Marcia Chambliss, Alabama SGPA State Coordinator. I'm going to ask each one of the ladies to introduce themselves, and then we'll go from there. Rosa, if you could start.
Hi, good afternoon.
Can you hear me? I am Rosa Leonetti, and I am New Jersey State Coordinator for Smart Girl Politics, and I'm also a veteran New York City Department of Ed teacher. No, it's not phenomenal. And I've been an activist for the past 10 years. Being a New York City teacher, being a conservative teacher, definitely helps to define you as an activist and helps you to definitely stand out whether you want to or not. But I can tell you that, like Diane said, I will reiterate, there are many of us. There are many, many conservative teachers. We're called rank and file for a reason. And I want you to know that during this time, we need support. Okay, and they're out there. You just have to make sure that when you see one, you hold her dear, or him dear, and then give them support. Okay?
Just intro first. My name is Joy Pullman. I like to borrow a line from Phyllis Schlafly and say thank you to my husband Nathaniel and to my 3 kids for letting me be here. This is the 4th event that I have done this week. And I do a lot of traveling, almost all related to Common Core because it has exploded in the past couple of months. And they are the ones who stay at home and stare at each other while I travel around talking to people like you. So the 3rd one doesn't have any choice about whether he comes or not, but the rest of them, have some good input. So I work for the Heartland Institute, which is a state-focused think tank that is headquartered in Chicago. I'm a Hillsdale College graduate, and this spring I won a fellowship to do some in-depth reporting on Common Core that I'll be conducting over the course of the next year. So I hope some of that I've already been doing, so I hope to have a lot to share with you from the work I've done so far.
I'm Marcia Chambliss. I'm the Alabama State Coordinator. I'm not a teacher. I'm not a policy wonk as far as education, but I am an activist that cares about what Common Core is going to do to our children and our grandchildren. I worked closely with the task force in Alabama trying to get our GOP-led legislature to repeal Common Core this past spring, and unfortunately, they peeled off one by one. But I think as the momentum grows, the opposition to Common Core, they are going to be hearing loudly and very frequently from the constituency. So I'm here basically to tell you what we did as activists and what we're still doing.
Thank you. So to lay out what Common Core is from a policy perspective, I'm going to ask Joy to begin.
So there are basically two trends in American education, or even in world education, that have been simmering under the surface for a long time, and Common Core makes the clash extremely obvious. So the two kind of choices you have, and somebody has to control education, right? You have to have somebody who's kind of the ultimate authority on deciding what happens with the child in regards to his or her upbringing and his or her education. So basically the two choices that you have are going with having parents be that, that ultimate stopping point, or you can have the government be the ultimate stopping point. And so Europe has chosen government to be the ultimate stopping point, and they have extremely centralized socialist systems of education. In fact, and the United States has been for decades moving toward that same thing. Greater and greater federal, national control over education, and less parent involvement, less and less parent control, less and less community participation in the democratic process. So I happen to think that's a problem, because the American government gives us this thing called the ability to self-govern, and it actually demands that we do that. And so there basically is the Common Core defines or kind of shows how we're at the point where you can't just assume that you can govern your kids, you can control them, and you have a voice in the process. And that's why it is crucial to stop this, and also go back to saying, wow, we need to do something different in education policy. Federal control is a really bad idea, and so on and so forth. So let me tell you what this thing is that we're sitting here talking about, because a lot of people don't know. And it sounds really simple, and it's very surprising to find out that it affects every single thing about what kids do in school besides busing and lunch. It's called, Common Core is just two things. It's called standards and assessments. So standards are just a list of what a bunch of folks think that kids should know in every grade. When you should do fractions, the methods that you should use for learning them, what age you should be able to read fluently, and how, whether you analyze a character from this book, according to, plot development and rise and fall, so on and so forth. Back in 2009 and 2010, a bunch of folks got together under the auspices of a bunch of special interests to write national education standards. So states had before that defined their own education standards. This is what we want kids to be doing in the classroom. So under the auspices of the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers, which are majorly federally funded private lobbying groups headquartered in Washington, D.C., a bunch of people sat down at conference, tables, they did teleconferencing, and they sent emails around what they thought kids needed to be learning in math and English from grades K through 12. So these standards published in 2010, and before the standards actually published, the federal government told states there was this thing called Race to the Top, which was embedded in the stimulus bill of 2009. And that's basically a $4.35 billion earmark that the U.S. Department of Education got. And in exchange for trying to get a piece of this, states had to promise the federal government that they would sign on to Common Core before Common Core had ever been published. So there were two deadlines for getting that federal money, and both of them were before Common Core ever existed. So all these states were saying, sure, federal government, we'll switch over standards and all of our tests. And no, we don't know what that will look like. But the other part of the Common Core kind of project, and that's the part that really ties in a lot of negative things, or all the repercussions for the rest of schools, is the testing. No longer are most states going to conduct their own state tests. You've heard about these various state tests that you do usually at the end of the year. Common Core, because there are national standards, the federal government has also funded national tests. So Common Core tests are going to say, did teachers do what Common Core tells them to do in the classroom? Did they teach the children what Common Core says to teach them? And we're going to find out by testing the kids and seeing the results. So as you've heard, the results are pretty striking, pretty disastrous. But the testing part is really important, because that's where largely Common Core affects everything about classrooms. So let me give you kind of a list the kind of points of contention and things that Common Core changes about classrooms. There's obviously textbooks. So education standards they're not all of what is in a textbook, so they basically give kind of a table of contents for textbooks, or for learning materials. I know a lot of kids, they don't use textbooks, they use computers, right? So what standards say, here's what your textbook, what your teacher has to cover in class during the school year in these subjects. So it also changes, of course, testing. And then tests, of course, are related to school funding. There's federal funds that depend on student test scores, there's state funds that depend on student test scores, and of course, there are teacher evaluations that often, in most states, that is another condition of race to the top that have to tie to student test scores. So, of course, then if a teacher evaluation is tied to that, then teachers' job prospects, their ability to remain in their job, or their ability to get fired and hired, yes, is really going to be dependent on the results of these Common Core tests. And it's basically all of the instruction in the classroom has to shift. And the problem with that, well, I'll get to that in a little second. So the other effects, so basically, like I said, it changes everything about the classroom besides buses and lunch. And the last kind of piece to know about is the technology, because Common Core tests have to be all on computers, all online. There's 2 national testing groups. One of them is, and all those national tests are coming out in the 2014-2015 school year. So one of those groups is saying to all of the states involved, we want you to be online immediately. 2014-2015, we need to have 1 computer in every school for every 2 kids in order to be able to take these Common Core tests. And basically about 17% of schools are able to do that right now. So we've got another year and a half for 83% of schools to buy the amount of computer hardware, software, tech, development and support, the broadband and so forth necessary to get Common Core, to get them able to actually test these kids according to these new national tests. So that is extremely expensive, and there is no new money for that anywhere. So costs are a big concern for people who just care about bread and butter, spending, on a time of, their years. Still, they say we're out of the recession, but it still feels like we're in the recession. It's tight budgets all around. It's hard for anybody getting money. So the costs are a big concern. And the thing I didn't mention also, but which is a big concern, is academic quality. If you hear anyone talk about Common Core in the newspaper or on the radio or so forth, you often hear these phrases kind of like they're issued from a parrot. Rigorous, internationally benchmarked. Rigorous, internationally benchmarked. So the idea is that while this is really high quality, we're asking kids to do things that are good for them. It's a really positive benefit to kids. We know this is going to help them learn better. But the little problem with that is there's no research to support it. So, and in fact, the research we do have, and independent experts as well as those who served on Common Core panels, folks who are trained at Harvard, at Stanford University, and so on and so forth, they say that rigorous and internationally benchmarked are literally lies to apply to Common Core. At the very best, it's a mediocre set of expectations for kids. So there's a big concern over academic quality in that respect. And then the last thing, let's see here, costs. So the part I also didn't mention that's a big concern for folks on both sides of the aisle is local control. So remember how I mentioned that Common Core was created by special interest groups and coerced on the states by the federal government? Well, that's kind of a problem. But not only that, it basically gives schools and states a way to excuse their actions. So when you go to them and say, as a teacher, as a parent, look, I don't think this is a good idea for what my child is doing in school. There's a lot of switch over to fuzzy math as a result of Common Core. Your 3rd graders asked to do conceptual math at the level of literally college advanced, algebra and, conceptual calculus and so forth. So if you're a parent and teacher and say, this actually practically does not work for my child, for the children under my care, you can't go to the school board and say, folks, look, I elected you, I pay your salaries, listen to all our complaints and do something about it, because they have been saying, and they will continue to say, Common Core says we have to do this. And Common Core is not controlled by your State Department of Education, your State Board of Education, so you can't go to them, who you also elect and pay, to say, look, we don't like this, it's bad for our kids, do something about it. Because they'll say, well, Common Core is copyrighted by these 2 outside organizations, and we have told the federal government that we would adopt it. And so you can't call up the National Governors Association and Chief Counsel of State School Offers to say, change this thing, because, well, even though your taxes pay also for a large portion of their salaries and their activities, they're private nonprofits who have no, requirement to paying attention to what you have to say. So basically, Common Core destroys, the American system of self-government, which is particularly strong in public education, which has long had from its very inception, it's had the history of being locally controlled, parent controlled, community controlled. So the very last thing that I want to mention is it's basically around the issue of testing. And there are lots and lots of details here, but the first thing to know is that there's three things actually. The first one is that nobody gets out of the testing, even if you're homeschooled or private school, because the ACT and the SAT in all state tests, except for the 3 states that opted out, are Common Core tests. So 26 states homeschoolers have to take the state test. And even if you don't, if you want your child to go to college, they have to take the ACT and SAT. The independent tests like the Iowa Basic, the Terra Nova, the Stanford 10, those are all, every single one of them has switched over to Common Core. So that greatly reduces parental, freedoms, family freedoms, school freedoms, and school choice. The second thing about the testing is that the testing is shifted, as you know from New York. It's not the kind of basic knowledge test that we're accustomed to. Can you do this? Can you add fractions? Can you multiply 3-digit numbers, and so on and so forth? They're switching around to asking, if you don't get the process correct, if you don't follow the correct procedure for answering the question, even if you get the right answer, if it's not the state-approved method for getting that answer, your child is marked wrong. That literally happened on the New York test, and the folks creating these new tests for the ACT, the SAT, and the National Common Core test are saying that's what we're all going to do. So there's a much more control over how and what teachers teach in the classroom and what kids have to be learning to a huge level that really limits creativity, right? You would think you want to be creative and think for yourself, get to the answer any blooming way you want to, but no. And the last portion is often the most explosive to parents is the data tracking involved with Common Core. So folks talking about Common Core will always come back to this and say, Common Core has nothing to do with data tracking. It's just standards. These are just academic goals. Oh, well, I don't think, it sounds like you haven't read the agreement that governors signed that started Common Core, which defines the initiative as standards plus assessments. It sounds like you haven't read anything else from all the folks who support Common Core about how the states that left the national assessments are really damaging their kids because those assessments are the enforcement mechanism for the standards, and so on and so forth. Common Core is standards plus assessments according to the people who created it. And it's those tests, those assessments, that tie states into huge privacy conflicts. And I'll outline that just really quickly. So every state involved with those tests signed a contract with the federally funded, even though that is actually literally illegal for the federal government to fund or influence tests or curriculum, but they did it, despite the 3 federal laws that say they can't. But they signed a contract with these federally funded, again, nonprofit, kind of ooky, no man's land organizations that says, we will give you access to student-level data that you specify about our children. And so the federal government has given templates for student-level data that it wants states to start collecting. And a number of states have started signing on to what's called the National Education Data Model. You can Google that and you'll find exactly what it is. It contains things like your child's blood type, your family religion, voting status, bus schedules, health insurance, so on and so forth. So it's extremely comprehensive. And then those testing organizations who have not defined what data that they will ask, but the federal government has indicated that it might be extremely intrusive, turn around and sign a contract with the federal government saying you will have open and complete access to any and all data collected at the state level. So if you have a state privacy law that protects your students' information, Wisconsin's, for example, has a very strong student privacy law. You cannot give your child's information to anyone without your consent. Once it's outside the state, it has to follow federal privacy law, which the Obama administration erased. Almost erased it, with another one of its famed executive order actions. In 2012, it just rewrote federal privacy law to say that it can change any data it gets about your kids without parent knowledge or consent. It can share them with any company, any individual, any agency that they want. So that's my quick download of all the info about Common Core. That's I hope that was a 10-minute version, and I'll just pass it on and let you have some questions later.
I think it's important. Rosa's next, and if you could discuss about what
And a lot of what is said will probably piggyback off of it. You mentioned the data mining, and the bottom line is, I'm going to try to simplify this for you. As an educator, you should be concerned that the Common Core, they call CCLS, right? Sometimes CCLS, sometimes CCL. the name is really real. The bottom line is that the educators are now forced to follow this template. The Common Core standards is not a curriculum. They're goals. They're goals set by the government. Anything that comes out of the DOE is never good. Since ESEA in 1969, right, the Elementary Secondary Education Act, we have been seeing these programs. Goals 2000, who remembers Goals 2000? That was the Bush baby, the first one. Then there was, the big one, NCLB, right? And while the assumption is always that it's meant to, which is the big thing here, especially when you're talking about Title I schools.
That means poor schools.
Okay, you need to know that the Title I schools govern everything. Title I schools are your poor schools. ESEA from 1969 came from that kind of umbrella where we need to close the gap. Common Core is an extension of all of these. Basically what they're saying is we need to level the playing field. And what is the favorite word that is often used? So when you read, when the NEA, who gives more money to the Democratic Party than any other organization, puts out an article that says, why the 6 reasons we should love Common Core, you should run. You should be frightened, you should go under your bed, grab your children, never come out. I read this and I said, oh my God, the 6 reasons, right? And what are the 6 reasons? And they're always it's always the same thing. It's always the same, equity. Because they want to close the gap between Black students and white students. I don't know where white Hispanics fall into that. But college readiness. That's the other reason. College readiness, because we are all supposed to go to college. Critical thinking versus rote thinking. Tell me, how many of you have nightmares because you memorized multiplication? I don't remember ever screaming, oh my God, 3 times 3 is 9! I'm like, that's it, I'm scarred for life. And then there's the data mining. Data mining, right? So what you should be afraid of, I mean, I'm joking because I try to simplify what was just said in my teacher way. Because when you're looking at the Common Core learning standards, you're looking at an implementation, not so much to bring rigor and critical thinking as to control and manipulate the parent away from that child. That's what it is. Anything. Remember, education in America was really at the hands of the parent, right? That's how it started. That's the founding. And where is it now? Who has it? The state, but no more. The state has it, and they're not giving it back. So you need to be aware that the data mining part of this is so frightening. When they're collecting information about your political affiliation, your religious affiliation, your blood type, they're not doing it because they're going to write a journal to praise you. They're doing it for a reason. They're mining it. It's called data mining for a reason. There are 3 areas that you should be mindful of as you enter your classrooms each and every day if you have children. The literacy component, which aims to take away and remove classical literature from the curriculum. So think of this. George Washington will not be taught, Frederick Douglass will not be taught, your kids will not know who Ronald Reagan is. But they will know who Frida Kahlo is, Barack Obama is, Che Guevara is. Do you see how dangerous that is? Civil War is gone in social studies. American Revolution is gone, replaced by the social justice themes of inequity and disparity and poverty. And you can see them. They're called now, instead of the classical literature, what you have instead of fiction and classical works and realistic fiction, they have another name for it. Informational text. Informational texts are everywhere. In science, gone are your, topics on, the atomic energy. Now it's all green energy. Green, 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 green. Everything is green. Your poor child comes home, my God, we're not living right. Mom, you can't leave the water running. Mom, you can't do this. You forgot to recycle. We need to turn off the light. They're policing you. Yes, it's cute, but it's not funny. Because what's happening is, they're being indoctrinated. In New York City, though we do not, I'm a pre-K teacher. I chose to teach pre-K after teaching elementary for a while, because I felt that maybe the damage would be less, right? And I could have more control. Goodbye. Guess who has the pre-K standards now? Common Core. I spent my entire year data mining. And so parents need to understand, in New Jersey, we have the best, one of the best legislative, processes in hand when it comes to homeschooling. They have been working at eroding that over the last year, to the point now where homeschooling will now change. And if you think, as I just did this past year, I took my kid out of, she graduated from 4th grade, and they follow the Princeton model in New Jersey. Took her out and I put her in Catholic school. Now Catholic, but in she goes, I want her to learn about Christ and be away from everything that's good for her. Well, you're not exempt, because now your Terra Novas, your ACTs, your GEDs, your SATs, your PSATs, everything will now be aligned to the Common Core learning standards. This malignancy has organizations such as the IRA. I know everything that has the IRA is like horrendous, but this is the International Reading Association, right? And when you go on that website and you look at who they started back in, same thing, not in 99. And when you look at who's on that panel for the IRA, they're the ones that have implemented a lot of the English language arts stuff. And when you look at who's on the panel, University of Chicago people, you have Dorothy Strickland, who did the standards in New York a while back, it blows your mind. It is time for you, the conservative parent, conservative teacher, to start questioning what is going on. It is, you know what, the fact that New York City and New York State did so poorly, it should not come as a shock. Because if the teachers, the educators who are at the forefront of curriculum are not understanding what they are to teach, how are the children expected then to follow? And the fact that they don't want the children to be involved in anything but the indoctrination of certain subject matter, I am not surprised that these children did as poorly as they did. Because the people teaching it do not understand it. So, having said that, I am now going to turn it over to Marcia, who's going to take you into legislative.
That it's all about green, 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 green. Well, it is. You need to follow the money. Because that is what this is all about. Bill Gates funded Common Core, what was it, $1 billion?
163 million as of February. It's probably over 200 right now.
That's an enormous investment, and there's got to be a reason for it. It's to control our children. If we think that just Googling information is going to be data mining, that is nowhere close to what's going to be collected on our children and grandchildren. And I do want to tell people, this is not necessarily a left-right, issue just for conservatives. It's an issue for those on the left too, because there are people that have liberal leanings that are disturbed about Common Core. They see what's happening in the classroom and it scares them. And there is a wonderful book that I want to recommend, and this is a guy that he does have a different ideology than I do. His name is Chris Nielsen, and it's Children of the Core. I highly recommend this book. As I said, it's not the same ideology as a conservative, but if you can see the tabs that I've marked in this book, those are all the areas where I agree with him. And it gives you good information that you can take back to your elected officials and explain to them in ways that don't sound like you're tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist, because believe me, we've been accused of that. We have members in our state legislature that think we're just nut jobs. But if you can get somebody that has a different political leaning than you do, that agrees with you about Common Core, we've got a problem. And there are so many websites out there. The Alabama group, and I was really dragged into this back in 2010, had no idea what Common Core was. We were focused on the election in 2010. We were flipping our state legislature to Republican, thought we were doing a great thing, and which we did. I'm not going to slam everything that they've done, but they're not listening to us as far as Common Core. Our former governor went full steam ahead at the request of our current governor, who asked him to please put off the vote until he took office so that he could vote on this on our State Board of Education. They ignored that request. And we've been fighting it ever since. I know more about Common Core than I thought I would ever in a lifetime know. It's complicated, and when you try to explain it to people, they'll glaze over. It is, but I think it's that way by design. The more complicated an issue is, the harder it is to explain to someone, and they tune you out. And that's why I also think we need to take a look at not using the red meat buzzwords about Common Core. If we can use terminology that appeals to both sides of the political aisle, we'll have a much better chance of reversing this. And I guess what I can just, from a state level, talk to as many people as you can. Talk to mothers, talk to grandmothers. We have a task force that's made up of former teachers. They're passionate about this because they see what's going to happen to the education system. Corporate reformers, in my opinion, are trying to dismantle the public education system. And there will be a way for them to come in after so many schools fail, scoop them up, and they will be profiting off of public dollars. And I think that's wrong. I think we can have a good public education system, but the state has to be in control of it, not the federal government. There's nothing positive or successful that comes out of Washington, D.C. Obamacare has shown that to us, and I think we're going to see it next with Common Core. Unfortunately, you've got people like Jeb Bush, Mike Huckabee. There is many Republicans that are pushing Common Core, as there are Democrats. So I think that's why we also have to be a little bit careful about how we label this. We can't label it as just being a Democrat issue, that the Democrats have pushed it, the Republicans have pushed it. And it's for the benefit of those corporate reformers. They are also trying to take over state legislature. Be careful about who the people are that are running for your state Senate and your state house, because they're being funded by these corporate reformers. When we started, I think I mentioned earlier, we had the support of so many Republicans that were going to repeal Common Core until they started discussion. And then they found out who was going to be funding the next election cycle. And it wasn't the grassroots. We don't have that kind of money. The business groups, the chambers of commerce, are in full support of Common Core. They are trying to create a workforce that fits their membership. They're going to try to recruit all of these businesses to come in. So they want to determine what that workforce looks like. To me, that's not the purpose of public education. That's not learning. You're taking creativity completely away from children, and you're going to make them into little robots that cannot think for themselves. So I just want to urge everybody, if you don't have a group in your state that's opposed to Common Core, start one. We have so many good websites around the country. The Alabama website is auee.org. That's Alabamians United for Excellence in Education. We have a wealth of information on that site. And a lot of it is detailed, but you'll find some other things that you can use and talking points that are not as complicated.
Thank you. We only have time for a couple of questions because we're running a little bit behind. Can I get a volunteer to take the microphone?
My coughing attack is over.
Hi, I am actually from Indiana, and as Joy knows, we've been working hard against this for quite some time. We have put a pause on it here. We're still fighting a lot of stuff. We just had our first summer session hearing on Monday, but I have two questions. The first to Joy. I know our governor has gotten us out of the park assessment. I know that doesn't really affect the Common Core standards as far as getting us out of that, but how does that? Because a lot of people, when they saw that, thought that took us out of everything. So I need to know how to say, I know it didn't, but I'm not exactly sure how to explain it. And my second thing was, and I don't know if I missed it, but when you mentioned you had 3 things to look for in the classroom, I got literacy components, and that's all I got. So I didn't know if I missed the other 2 or you didn't get to them yet.
Literacy, social studies, and science.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I've got grandkids, so I'm looking out.
Well, as you probably know, the Indiana this spring paused Common Core. So we withdrew from the National Common Core tests, and we said we're not going to keep rolling out the standards in the classrooms. So we have Common Core in K2 this year, and then not in the rest of the grades. And we're deciding whether we'll keep our state standards, probably improve them, or if we're going to return to Common Core. So our State Board of Education gets to decide that after the legislative session next spring, July 2014. So we could, so the first thing to know, of course, is that we could go back to Common Core and plug right back into all those tests. That is an open question. But the thing, usually when I'm talking to state legislators around the country and to activists, the number one thing for me to get rid of is those National Common Core tests. Those are the plug-in to, those are the enforcement mechanism, those are the plug-in to the data mining, those are the plug-in to way more federal oversight. If you can do nothing else, get rid of the tests, and that's something that both the left and the right agrees about, because you have, teachers on the left who, and the kind of institutional folks on the left, especially within the school system, who are not in favor of all these, grinding into the teachers using outside tests and so on and so forth. And then you have fiscal concerns about the tests. They're more expensive than most states' tests and so forth. So number one, if you're an activist, that would be your number one target. And you have 1 year to do that because, like I said, those tests kick in 2014, 2015. And so after that, the next thing I think states should do is you want to enact your own privacy law. So Oklahoma has a really good privacy law that they just passed. It starts with a review of what's all the stuff we collect, what's all the stuff we've promised to collect, and then the next year, the next legislative session, they're going to decide publicly whether the level of collection and the privacy for kids is appropriate, in public view. And so then the third thing is the whole hog repeal, which has been a very difficult thing because of all the entrenched cross-interest after it. So to date, no state has done that yet, and so Indiana may be the first one, but Indiana's pausing inspired a number of other states to do the same thing. And so the same thing with the test. So once the testing costs were announced, and I actually think the Common Core enterprise may dissolve once those tests reach the classrooms because of the tests, because of the absolute wasteland of infrastructure available for those tests to even exist. In 7 states, we had the tests collapse that were trying to be on the computer just because they couldn't handle that many kids online at the amount of time. But that's usually the kind of strategy that I tell folks.
And that's a very important step, because I was speaking about that with Marcia yesterday, about removing yourself from the park consortium. Once you remove yourself from that, you have more flexibility, more control over your curriculum, okay, than if you are part of that. To date, there are 5 states that are doing that. I think there are 3 that are done in 2. But there's also, in Colorado, there was a district that was able to remove itself and be exempt from using Common Core learning standards. Their fight and their model, unique to the district, but nonetheless, I think Heritage had the piece on it. So I urge everyone, always check with the education notebook at Heritage, because it always does the work that we don't have time to do. And they have the people doing it. One other thing I want to say, a while ago, E.D. Hirsch, who wrote a great book, Cultural Literacy.
Read it.
Read it.
Please read it.
If you were to read any one
Yes,
book,
yes.
Cultural Literacy, what our kids do not know,
Yeah.
right? Need to know. And he crafted, I don't know if you remember this a while back, the series, what your kindergarten needs to know, what your first grader needs to know. And he called that the common knowledge, not to be confused with Common Core. They're just a body of knowledge that you should have, that your child should have, in order to be classically educated. If you can, get that. Arm yourselves, because the bottom line is that you can remove Common Core, and then the people, the stakeholders, right, that need the money, will say, but our children are ill-prepared. They won't be ill-prepared if you're well-informed. Okay?
Unfortunately, because we're running so far behind, I do have to end the panel, but our panelists will be here if you'd like to have further questions for them. Thank you for speaking to us, and again, they'll be available for questions later.